The piston kit includes all the parts you need to service the piston itself. It includes a new piston, the piston ring, the wrist pin, washers, and 2 new wrist pin retainers. The most common reason to replace the piston is low compression. This can be caused by dirt or dust wearing the piston rings. It can also be caused by a lean running engine or fuel that doesn't have enough oil in it. When there is damage to the piston, there will usually also be damage to the cylinder. The cylinder should be carefully inspected whenever there is piston damage and also replaced if needed. Replacing a damaged piston is a moderately difficult repair, but I'm going to show you how so you can do it yourself.
Hi, I'm Mark Socha.
Do-it-yourself repairs like these are easier than you might think. From lawn machines to cordless drills, kitchen mixers,
Outdoor grills.
our how-to videos walk you through each repair from start to finish. So doing it yourself means never having to do it alone.
Let's get started.
I'll begin by removing the top cover from the engine. I'll go ahead and remove the spark plug as well. Now I'll remove the air filter cover, the air filter, and I'll remove the air filter base and carburetor. Behind the carburetor, I'll disconnect the ignition wires. And now I'll remove the fuel tank. Next, I'll remove the plastic housing beneath the muffler. And now I can separate the clutch housing and shaft from the engine. With the engine separated, now I'll remove the ignition coil, the carburetor insulator, and the muffler. Now I can separate the cylinder from the crankcase. With the cylinder removed, I have access to the piston. Next, I'll remove one of the retaining rings so I can begin removing the piston. I'll grab the end of the retaining ring with a pair of needle nose pliers and pull it away from the piston. Next, I need to remove the wrist pin. Depending on the condition of the engine, you may be able to simply push the wrist pin away from the piston. But if the wrist pin is stuck in place, you may need to use a wrist pin press. To use this tool, I'll need to remove the second retaining ring, and then I place the press over the piston, insert the rod through the opening in the piston against the wrist pin, and begin to rotate the threaded rod. The tool will then press the wrist pin out the hole on the other side. Once I get it started, I'll remove the adapter, and now I can finish removing the wrist pin. With the wrist pin removed, I can remove the piston from the connecting rod, and I'll make sure I locate the washers so they don't fall down into the crankcase. Now I can begin installing the new piston. First, I'll install one of the 2 retaining rings into the piston. The retaining rings line up with grooves just inside the hole for the wrist pin. I'll insert the long end of the retaining ring into the groove and then carefully compress the retaining ring completely into the groove. You want to be careful you don't lose the retaining pin as you do this. Also be careful to not over compress it. Now I'll install the piston back onto the connecting rod. You'll notice on the top of the piston there's a small arrow. That arrow needs to point to the exhaust side of the engine. As I install the piston, I'll use some 2-cycle mix oil to pre-lubricate all of the bearing surfaces. I'll insert the wrist pin through the opening that doesn't already have the retaining ring in it. I'll install one of the washers onto the wrist pin, And now work the piston onto the connecting rod and needle bearing, again making sure the arrow points to the exhaust side of the engine. It's important to verify the location of the washers. You want to make sure they don't fall down into the crankcase as you install the piston. At this point I have the wrist pin through one side of the piston, one washer, and most of the way through the needle bearing. Now install the second washer. I'll use a small screwdriver to push the wrist pin all the way into the piston. I'll use the second retaining ring to secure the wrist pin. You want to be sure that you only use the new retaining rings that come in the kit. Don't reuse the ones you removed because they'll be compressed and can come loose, damaging the engine. And now I just need to install the new piston ring. You'll notice at the end gap there's a quarter round cut out of each side of the piston ring. I need to align that quarter round with the pin in the piston. Now I can reinstall the cylinder. As I reinstall the cylinder, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the gasket. The gasket you remove will likely be damaged. I'll place the gasket on top of the crankcase housing. You'll notice there's a notch on one side of the housing, and I'll align the notch in the gasket in that location. Make sure you get it flipped the right direction so it lines up with the screw holes. Now I'll apply some oil to the piston and to the inside of the cylinder. There's an arrow on the top of the piston. That arrow needs to align with the exhaust port on the cylinder. The piston ring end gap needs to align with the metal post inserted in the side of the piston. Now I'll compress the piston ring as I slide the cylinder over the piston. Once in place, I'll re-secure it with the screws. Now reinstall the muffler and the carburetor isolator. You'll want to inspect the gaskets and replace them as needed. Now reinstall the ignition coil. I'll rotate the flywheel so the flywheel magnets are pointing up towards the top of the cylinder. I need to set a gap between the ignition coil and the magnets. The proper gap in this case is 14 thousandths of an inch. I have a gapping tool, which is nothing more than a piece of plastic that's that dimension. I'll place the gapping tool between the ignition coil and the magnets and install the screws. Before I tighten the screws, I'll make sure the ignition coil is pushed firmly against the gapping tool and that it's over the top of the magnets. Then I can tighten the screws. Now I can reinstall the engine to the clutch and shaft assembly. Now reinstall the fuel tank. Next, I'll reinstall the carburetor and the air filter base. And again, I'll be careful to not over-tighten these screws so I don't crack the insulator. I'll reconnect the ignition wires. Fold them over and secure them underneath with the wire holder. Now I'll reinstall the plastic housing that goes beneath the muffler. I'll reinstall the air filter and the air filter cover. I'll reinstall the motor cover and And I'll finish up by reinstalling the spark plug. And that's all it takes to install a new piston kit in your small engine. Be sure to check back often for new videos and expert advice. If you found this video helpful, give us a thumbs up.